Hi everybody. Welcome to this brief video. I'm going to try and go quickly and get all 15 minutes in here, but this is just my video going through all the information regarding Canada's human geography. So the first part I'm going to be talking about is Canada's early history. So the First Nations group, that's what they call Native Americans, like the equivalent of Native Americans. In Canada, they're called First Nations. And they settled crossing the Beringia, which is the land bridge that connected Asia and North America back over 10,000 years ago. There's not an exact date of when people crossed. It's said that people crossed for thousands of years as long as there was ice or land that connected it. But now with the rising ocean levels of over the last 8,000 years or so, they're not able to cross anymore. So there's not a connected, so the ocean covers it. Anyway, the last ice age ended around that time, and the ice receded north very slowly over about 1,000 years. And many groups settled where they could grow crops and fish. The Vikings founded Canada in Newfoundland around 10,000 AD when a group of Vikings led by Leif Erikson crossed the ocean going west of Greenland, and they were kind of blown off course a little bit, and they were settled in what is now Newfoundland. And the settlement was abandoned for some reason. People don't really know. And then Giovanni Caboto, John Cabot, which is the name in English, was an Italian explorer, and then he settled in Newfoundland on behalf of England. And then from there, that settlement kind of died out as well because of disease and starvation. So then the French eventually settled in about 1534, and since then it's been settled quite a bit by Europeans, but like I said, lots of First Nations people were there. The French explored the areas and were dominating the area, but with fur trade with a lot of the First Nations groups. France and Great Britain eventually went into conflict because they both were kind of settling the same areas. And the goal for them was to take over land and dominate the fur trade. So furs were from foxes or from beavers or from some other animals that have valuable furs. Mink was another one, and badgers and different like animals that have fur. And so those were coveted in Europe, and they were kind of a luxury good, but they were plentiful in Canada. Diseases like smallpox impacted a lot of the First Nations, populations. And then Great Britain eventually took over after the French and Indian War, took over much of New France, and New France is what they called the territory. Basically, from there was two sides of Canada, the French Catholic and then the British Protestant. And so Britain decided to divide it into two different provinces: Upper Canada, which is Ontario, which is mostly along the Great Lakes, and then Quebec, which is called Lower Canada. I might have these switched around. Let me make sure of that next time. But basically, the Upper and Lower Canada. There was a conflict between the two in the 1830s, and there's kind of some rebellions from Native peoples as well. So the British government decided eventually to create the Dominion of Canada, which united all of Ontario, Quebec, and then the Atlantic provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. The conflict between France and England during this time, the people of Nova Scotia were once called Acadians, or from Acadia. That's what it was called when the French controlled it, and they were exiled to Louisiana in the U.S., so like the southern part of the U.S. So that's why there's a French-speaking population in New Orleans or in Louisiana in the United States, because a lot of the French from the Nova Scotia area, from that area of Canada, were exiled to the United States or to Louisiana. So expansion, the Dominion ended up growing really rapidly. It gained control of Rupert's Land in 1869, and Rupert's Land was kind of the area that not a lot of people lived in, kind of along Hudson Bay into the northwest of Ontario. And then they expanded eventually to the Pacific Ocean, with Manitoba and British Columbia joining. Also, Prince Edward Island joined, and eventually the Dominion was fully formed in 1949 with Newfoundland. And then in 1999, they created a new territory called Nunavut, and we'll talk about Nunavut here in a second. But Basically, the continent developed a rail line from Montreal to Vancouver, which connected both coasts. And the Yukon Territory was a place where they found gold. It was called the Klondike Gold Rush. And not long after, there was lots of mining taking place all over the country. And then many immigrants from Europe decided to come in the late 1890s, 1880s into the 1920s. Just like in the US, a lot of Europeans were immigrating for various reasons. And over time, Canada began to really develop its natural resources and then grow in population. A lot of the population growth occurred and still is within 100 miles of the US border. Because it's too cold and difficult to live elsewhere. Canada was recognized as an independent country in 1931 by Great Britain. Before that, they were kind of held under Great Britain as kind of like a colony or kind of like a territory of Great Britain, as was much of the world was kind of dominated by Great Britain before that. Canada has a parliamentary government, just like Great Britain. It has members of parliament from all different areas of the country and their various political parties. The head of state is still Queen Elizabeth, but the major leader in Canada is known as the Prime Minister, and he acts as the chief executive and the leader of Parliament. So that's kind of how they rule their government in that way. They also have the court system, but mostly Canada runs its government through the parliamentary system. As you can see with this map, there's a lot of people that live very close to the Great Lakes, but also just close in general to the U.S. border and on the coasts, because that's kind of the most habitable land. That's where the most population density is. Alberta and Ontario are kind of the most populous provinces. Quebec is also pretty populous, but as you can see, the Toronto area is kind of a massive city. It's probably like the top three in North America, but the largest in Canada for sure. As you can see, this map, they're within 100 kilometers. There's a lot of people that live in this kind of area. It's very densely populated as well. Here's a picture of Quebec. Quebec City was the oldest founding city settlement in Canada. It was first founded in about 1607 or so, 1608. I think, can't remember. But yeah, 1608 by Samuel de Champlain, and it's a beautiful city, very French oriented, very unique French architecture. Basically, here's the general history of Canada as a union, as a dominion, and then as its own independent country. Dominion just means that they were kind of like a territory of Great Britain, but they also kind of like had their own rights and everything like that. The growth of the country, here's how it started and then eventually expanded, and here's the Dominion. And then the British controlled much of like Rupert's Land, Northwest Territories, and British Columbia. And then it united, and this is the country that it is today. There's also a lot of like British ties to their traditions and their government. The Parliamentary Palace looks like it'd be plucked right out of London. The ceremonial guard is very London-esque. The early cultures of the First Nations, there's also this group called the Inuit people, which were settled kind of in the northern, northwest parts of Canada, kind of near the Hudson Bay and then even to the west of that. They also have a lot of, the First Nations people have a lot of Asian characteristics in terms of their appearance, because they came from their origins are tied to the people that crossed the Beringia in ancient times. Fishing and fur trade are the dominant cultural and economic ties that connect all people, regardless of where they come from. That's kind of like Canada's main history is through fishing and fur trade. French explorers kind of explored a lot of the land. They're known as voyageurs, and they began connecting the country and exploring different things. The primary industries in Canada, natural resources trading is kind of how it started, and then now it's more services and industrial oriented. About 5% of the land in Canada is arable. That means it can be used for farming. It does have significant agriculture, just like it does in the US, but not very many people are needed to do that because it's highly industrialized. Logging is really important because there's lots of forests, so they export a lot of paper. Mining is also very important. They have a lot of of minerals and different resources. And then also Canada has 3 coastlines, so there's lots of fishing, but overfishing has caused things to change a little bit, so more sustainable methods are used. Manufacturing is very important, makes up for about 12.5% of the GDP. They produce a lot of different things, including appliances, electronics, steel, automobiles, mining equipment, and they export quite a bit of it to the US, which helps kind of not rely the US not rely on some other places. Most of the manufacturing occurs in Quebec and Ontario. And some service industries. So more than 70% of the GDP comes from service industries, employing millions of people. Tourism is very much growing in Canada, and a lot of exports are occurring. Canada trades mostly with the US. They get about 75% of their import or exports, they go to the US, and then they import about 65% of their goods from the US. So a lot of trading going on. NAFTA, definitely need to know that. It's the North American Free Trade Agreement, agreed upon between the US, Canada, and Mexico. The culture, there's a lot of cultural mixing, I guess. The Métis people are the French mix of heritage of French and First Nations people. Sometimes it includes all First Nations people. There's a lot of cultural interaction happening between lots of different people. They have immigrants from all over the world that have settled there, but it's still a relatively low population country, only 36 million people or so. Canada is a bilingual country. Its official languages are French and English. Quebec is the French-speaking province. It contains about 75% of the French-speaking population. First Nations languages are also still spoken very widely, especially in the territories. And there's definitely kind of a dual culture of Canadians that are Roman Catholic, but also Protestant. And there's also Islam and Judaism. Canada's population has been able to withstand a lot of the harsh environment and accessibility to transportation. Those 2 things are really important. Most people live just on 10% of the land within 100 miles of the US border. 75% of Canada's French-speaking citizens, I said, lived in Quebec. About 80% of people live in cities, and the territories in the north have the Inuit population, and large proportions of Asian ancestries live along the west coast. So life in Canada today. Canadians are very active personally and professionally, and citizens enjoy a relatively high standard of living. Canada's people are very well educated, and they have a 99% literacy rate. They also love their sports. They're home to hockey. Hockey was invented there, and they love their outdoor sports like ice skating, skiing, fishing, hunting, those kind of things. Very outdoorsy people, despite the cold. Lacrosse was also a sport that was invented by First Nations people here in Canada, and then rodeo is also very popular in the western provinces, including especially in Calgary. Canada has a rich artistic history. There's a lot of literature, oral traditions, very popular carvings that have been made by the Inuit people from whale bones, soapstones, and ivory, and then totem poles were constructed by the First Nations along the west coast. There's a Toronto-based group that kind of invented a new Canadian style of painting, and then they've also have a lot of musical artists, theater traditions, and things like that. Here is how Canada's workers have changed different industries. So services have become way more dominant, from 51% to 78%. Here are some agricultural and industry map of Canada. Sorry, this is kind of blocking it, but so there's just a lot of more activity going down near the US border. Here's some information about kind of the cultural changes that have been going on. It's very culturally diverse, so sometimes that presents some challenges, but also the people there are very kind and have tried to figure out what is best for the government culturally, and they're very culturally diverse and open to diversity and immigration. Canada love to play hockey and be outside. They also have some different cultural things like being able to drive and vote very early. Here is a man producing a something out of soapstone, which is a kind of a unique stone found in the northern part. So I'm going to do a second video here on the subregions of Canada, but I hope you enjoyed this and look forward to my next video. Bye.